First of all, the figures that we looked at past special elections. I mean, if you think about it, those were all non-participating candidates that we were looking at. So the data, we think, is very reflective of what a current non-participating candidate would be faced with and what they could raise. But in terms of the idea about what's wrong with starting low and then use matching funds if they're needed, and there's some sense, of course, to that argument. And when we look at these, we try to look not just at today's race, but other races, at different scenarios that might come into play. So, for example, if you have a participating candidate who perhaps is a relatively unknown running against an incumbent, I have heard that there are advantages to incumbency, that you have your name in the paper, you're out there doing good work, and so there is some advantages to your candidacy when you run as an incumbent. And so perhaps then as a campaign strategy, you could keep your campaign spending relatively low, starving funds from a challenger. Or as another scenario that could possibly happen is that if a person who is a participating candidate thinks that they have $66,000, $75,000, $100,000 to run, they have a campaign strategy built around that, and then at the last minute, a non-participating candidate is able to put a bunch of money into the race and sort of as a strategy, do some last-minute serious spending, that participating candidate will be scrambling and having to change their strategy. Now, granted, that is campaigning, right? As you all know, people are responsible for their own campaign strategies.
Yeah, with all due respect, I think this is where you guys have gotten yourself into trouble. Because if an incumbent finds himself or herself in a runoff, they've got a lot more problems than strategizing the amount of dollars they're not going to spend is going to fix for them. They're in trouble. I mean that's the real world is if an incumbent on the city council is running for re-election and finds that in the primary he or she cannot garner 50% plus one vote, they're in a lot of trouble. And they're in a lot more trouble than gaming the amount of dollars that they're going to get is going to say. I would argue the opposite. If you're an incumbent and you find yourself in a runoff after having been an incumbent and you decide as a strategy you're going to underspend the person that's in second, you might as well start pulling the pictures down off your wall because you're done.
I appreciate that point.
Well, I mean, this is what we do for a living, and I think where you guys have gotten into trouble is in an attempt to be fair, you've outthought the practical implications of what you're doing, and it appears as though you're not fair. It appears that way. I don't think that that's the case, but I think the appearance is not good. And so the part that's been mystifying for me has been almost a spin, it feels like. The council's changing the rules. The council's not changing the rules. The council is adopting rules for special election. And then second, trying to second guess what the experts are recommending the amount should be. I mean, I looked at your report and frankly was flabbergasted that you had Liz Kaufman, who everybody who's nationally known as one of the best political consultants in the nation. Any candidate who gets Liz for a consultant has a leg up. It's an axiom of politics in this area. And then you have an anonymous source who comes up with 150,000. Liz comes up with approximately 100,000. You pick the anonymous source. It appears that way.
Sure, I can understand it appears that way, but it's not how that worked in our
thought process. It may not be, but what has troubled me more and more throughout this experiment is that the architects and administrators haven't stepped back to look at what their actions are doing to the appearance of the program. And the appearance of the program is that if we tried to do anything up here, I mean, if I issued a report that had a named consultant, Liz Kaufman, that recommended Randy Leonard, Commissioner Randy Leonard, and then I had an anonymous source that was recommending $150,000, and I was known to favor the participating candidate, and I picked the anonymous source, I could stand here all day long and say, I know it looks bad, but I really picked this number for other reasons, and I would be hung out to dry.
I think there's some congruency in those recommendations that perhaps Gary can explain better than I am, because I must say he's much better with numbers than
Okay.
The second consultant who wished to remain anonymous basically ratified everything, the methodology that Liz Kaufman had laid out in calculating how to get a message out to a certain number of voters. The only difference between those two consultants was the projection of the turnout rate for a special election. Liz Kaufman talked about a 25 to 30% turnout rate for a special election. Her experiences covers a wide range of elections, but when we looked at what that consultant said was, given the political climate with a hotly contested presidential race, I think we're going to have a higher turnout in July. That wasn't enough for the commission. Janice Thompson from Democracy Reform had done research and brought in the fact that the last two special election runoffs for council races, the first one was 38.6% turnout. The second one was 40.7 or 8% turnout, essentially right around 40%.
And I really appreciate that, Gary. I really do. But what you're telling me, in essence, is that you've discounted the advice of a recognized expert. Well, let me finish. And discounted and accepted the advice of one of the architects of this system that analyzed a consultant's report who chose to remain anonymous. Then the question I have to ask is, did the person choose to remain anonymous because they're advising one of the candidates and didn't want that disclosed and have their numbers analyzed in view of the fact that they may be advising one of the candidates? I mean, it raises a number of credibility questions.
The only thing we accepted from the consultant, from this architect, as you describe her, was two statements of fact, which were the turnout rates for those races, which were contrary to Liz Kaufman's assumption. And using Liz Kaufman's logic, applying a more realistic turnout rate brought the numbers higher. So it's
but
not
I can
that,
imagine a scenario in which I, as a candidate, would tell Liz Kaufman her analysis, that's what I pay her for, is wrong. And you have to show me why it's wrong, and you're relying on an anonymous consultant that's having the numbers tweaked by one of the architects of the system.
I'm sorry we can't convince you.
Well, no, is that wrong?
You're wrong.
But I thought you just said that democracy
You said
in
that
action.
we accepted the word of an anonymous consultant.
You didn't, because you
No.
had
We
Janice
got-
Thompson
We got objective data.
from Janice Thompson.
Sure, she volunteered it and brought it in.
Right, the system.
She brought in two pieces of data that anyone can get off the internet.
Okay.
Didn't those two special elections also have ballot measures on them?
I don't believe so.
Something small in Fairview on one of them. I think there were issues, but small issues.
I mean, no one can predict what the turnout rate's going to be, but what we can best do is work on what we had historically experienced here in Portland, and it was a higher turnout rate than Liz Kaufman was using in her assumption. It's not that we're disagreeing with what she's saying, we're just taking what she's got as an estimate, questioning one of her estimates and saying, well, it doesn't quite match up with Portland's experience. So, it's really council's call here. Frankly, I think the commission did a lot of thinking and tried its best to come up with what I thought was a fair amount, but ultimately, arguing about whether there was intentional or accidental bias one way or the other doesn't really get at the answer. So I would just encourage council to